Hello to everyone, and welcome to the Workplace Pride UN Toolkit webinar. This is Workplace Pride's fifth webinar in our series of keeping members connected. And I believe that we're probably going to have a few new people coming to this specific webinar. So let me just give you a very brief background about the Workplace Pride. Workplace Pride has been around for 14 years, and we work specifically on the topic of LGBTI workplace inclusion. We have many different stakeholders from the private sector, public sector, academia, and we work very closely with civil society. And one of the initiatives that we were involved in was with the United Nations when they, about 3-4 years ago, started the United Nations LGBT Standard Toolkit. Now, Graham, our speaker today, is going to be telling you all about the toolkit and walking you through this. But I want to tell you a few more things about it myself. First of all, this was developed by the United Nations UN Commission for Human Rights. Workplace Pride, as I said, and some of our members were actually involved in the consultation process. And it is meant as a tool, or actually as a document to be able to help the connection between businesses and the LGBTI community around the world. So it's very much international. There were actually consultations in Hong Kong, in Brussels, in which we were involved in, and in New York City. So the toolkit that we have developed is actually a very practical way of looking at how to interact with our community and with businesses. And so what Graham is going to be showing you is how we've worked this out over the past year. So at this point, I would like to introduce my very esteemed colleague, Graham Sparks. Graham is an advisory board member of Workplace Pride, and previously he was the global head of diversity and inclusion for Shell. So he certainly knows what he's talking about and is very well placed to walk us through this toolkit today. So Graham, I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, David, and good morning and good afternoon, maybe even good evening to a few of you. It's a great pleasure to be with you today as we launch the Workplace Pride UN LGBTI Standards Toolkit. I think it's fair to say we're all living in very strange times at the moment, and for me this is a time when inclusion and collaboration, both at work and outside work, probably become more important than ever, and we read a lot about that in the media, of course. And we also know that the current situation with coronavirus is also impacting LGBTI people. We're seeing that many pride parades have been cancelled this summer for entirely understandable reasons due to COVID-19. And we know that people have been creative and finding ways to take those online or virtually, etc. But it does mean that one way in which we can maintain and raise the profile of the LGBTI community has temporarily at least gone. And I think for me of more concern is we seem to see daily now some evidence of rising homophobia in various countries across the world. And sadly, as often happens at times of stress, some people and probably of greater concern, some leaders look to blame marginalised groups. And I think in that sense, being on this call today and the work that we do together can certainly help. So I really hope today can be about looking ahead and exploring our new UN LGBTI toolkit, which will help to support the standards, and I'll go into those a little more detail in a moment, and ensure that we can all move from advocacy to action and drive LGBTI inclusion in the workplace in line with Workplace Pride's core mission. So I'm going to take about 30 minutes to take you through an overview of the toolkit. What you see today is already available on the Workplace Pride website, both in a web version and also a downloadable version. We'll cover details of that right at the end. I'm going to explore some of the key features. And if you have questions as we go along, please do type them into the chat box. They're being moderated, and we'll have time at the end for some Q&As. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into the toolkit and start really with an overview of what we have, and then spend a bit of time to go through what these standards are all about, why they matter, how to use them, which really is at the core of the toolkit, and also, most importantly, how we sustain progress. It's all very well to put these things into place, and we have an initial launch as we have today, but it's what we do in the months and even the years going ahead, which I think is probably the most important. David touched on the overview, and let me just bring that one up so we can take a look at that in a little more detail. Again, a little bit about the background to the UN standards. They were actually launched in 2017 by the UN Human Rights Group, but you can actually look at the history of these right back to 1948. And the Declaration of Human Rights. There's been obviously various steps along the way. Probably the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015 are perhaps one of the most important links that we see there, which at the time did not explicitly mention LGBTI. And one of the reasons that these standards came forward. I first got kind of aware of these probably 2.5 years ago, or so 2.5-3 years ago, when I was doing the lead role at Shell, as David has mentioned, and I immediately read them and thought, yeah, great piece of work. And there's a couple of, this is the only visual in the whole presentation, a couple of nice brochures you can download on the UN. You download those from the UN website. Great piece of work, but they came with a dilemma, and the dilemma, or the difficulty that we found certainly at Shell, was, okay, we've got these, what do we do with them? And the solution that we've been working on with Workplace Pride and launching today is this toolkit, which really is intended to be a practical step to help people understand what these standards are about, and also coming to practical steps that you can take to both implement the standards and, most importantly, drive forward your LGBTI inclusion strategy. Again, just to repeat from the beginning, if you have questions, please just type them in. Mike will be moderating those, and we'll get to those at the end of the session. I think it's also important to say, and I'll touch on this later, that though the standards go into quite a lot of depth on various issues, which I'll come to in just a moment, this is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It has to be adjusted to your company, your where you are, your maturity in the whole work around LGBTI inclusion, and most importantly, that bridge into civil society and the external interfaces as well. And again, we'll touch on this as we go through. Let's just look now at the standards themselves. Some of you probably will be familiar with those already. This is a summary, and you can see the icons at the top, a summary of the 5 standards which the UN came up with, starting with respect to human rights on the left-hand side, through eliminate discrimination, providing support to the LGBTI community, preventing other human rights violations, and lastly, acting in the public sphere. Now, these are not intended to be linear. You go through step 1, step 2, but I think it's fair to say the items on the left-hand side, particularly around human rights, discrimination, and providing support, are probably already in many organisations' LGBTI plans, whether they be their D&I plans or the work being done by their employee networks. And I know when I first looked at these at Shell, we thought, yeah, these seem familiar, but there may be some gaps. So we actually went back through some of our policies, looking at our business case, looking at our code of conduct, and we made some changes. What one of you might say is fairly basic, but nonetheless extremely important in terms of getting the messaging right as to what we stand for, and also how those values apply across the business wherever you choose to operate. If we move to the right-hand side, the 4th one is very much around looking externally, looking at your supply chain. So what are you doing with your suppliers, with your distributors and your customers, and how are you working with them to prevent discrimination and ensure that the whole supply chain is taking a view around LGBTI inclusion? And on the right-hand side is probably the area where arguably we can have the most impact, but also I'm well aware can be the most difficult, and is very much can be regional or country specific, where we look at from the corporate world what we can do around acting in the public sphere, what can we do around getting a message out externally. And that, I think, is where the relationship and working with civil society organizations around the world is really key. So we'll come back to a little bit more detail on those in a moment. But for now, I'd just like to move to the next step of this, which is really looking at why these standards matter. And I think the first thing to say is let's look at the business case. Now, I'm sure many on the call today will be familiar with the business case for LGBTI inclusion. There are many of these. You can Google them, you can download them, you can get hold of them. And I've seen many over the years, also working with Workplace Pride, who've done some work on this themselves. What we've tried to do here is pull together, probably what are the key components of that, and you'll see elements around leadership and talent, and productivity and performance. Some people choose to call it employee engagement, and fourthly, with a external focus, a piece around brand and reputation. You'll see variations of that, I think, in many LGBTI business cases. We've attempted to put some of the key metrics in here, and top right you'll find some more sources if you want to go into this in more detail. But perhaps it's the item on the left, which particularly these days I think is probably the most important, and it ends with a statement: this is just the right thing to do. For sure, you can come up with your well thought through business case, you can put dollars behind it, you can put numbers behind it, but actually, and I think probably the biggest driver for me in being involved in this work, it is simply the right thing to do. There are some pieces around there linked to the UN work around human rights, but also, and again, sorry to repeat, but this is very much the domain of civil society, of NGOs. So working with those organisations at country level is so important in terms of getting your overall message out there externally. And I think we're also seeing increasingly resonating with employees as well. So that's a little bit on the business case, and again, there's more detail to be found around that. And I just wanted to highlight some of the comments from Workplace Pride member organisations. I don't intend to go through these in great detail. You can read them later at your leisure. But as mentioned, 270 companies have endorsed the UN LGBTI standards, and 25 of those are members of Workplace Pride, and they've been kind enough to provide some words around why they believe the standards are important, and also something perhaps to think about in your own organisation. Why is it important in your workplace? Again, we saw Sodexo, Clifford Chance, and Baker McKenzie on the previous slide. And now we see SAP, Shell, Nokia, and Deloitte. So again, I think that's another example of personalising this. So I spent a bit of time there looking at what and why. I'd now like to move on and spend really the bulk of the rest of our time looking at the how. Because it's fine to have the standards and read the toolkits and download stuff from the internet, but it's what are you actually going to do about it, I think is really important. And that's where we try to bring together the practical elements on this. So if we just move forward and look at an overview of how to use the UN LGBTI standards, you'll see 4 steps: getting started, action planning, good practices, and lastly, an implementation plan. Again, not intended to be entirely linear, but there are questions to be asked as you go through this. There's other resources to use. So, for example, the good practices draws on work that Workplace Pride has done now over many years, and putting a plan in place which really gets to the heart of what we're going to do, and probably more importantly, who's actually accountable for that, and how we're going to track it. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time to go through each of these steps, spending also some time on the action planning piece, which is at the core of the toolkit, and hopefully that will be useful to you. And of course, some curiosity and an interest to follow up on this. So let me begin with getting started. And the approach we've used here is in a very simple way. Just start by asking yourself some questions, and they're up top left. So if you look at the work that your organisation is doing on LGBTI inclusion, or if for those on the call from civil society organisations, the work that you're perhaps supporting out there in the community and with organisations locally. Where are you today? And at what level are you at? And if you see below, we've given a description of various levels that organisations may be as they go through this. Starting on the left-hand side, and this is an organisation which no doubt has got good intent and some commitment from some committed individuals. So LGBTI inclusion is on the agenda, but there may not be any plans, may not be any resources, and probably being done in terms of let's get the basics right. We've got something in our code of conduct. We're ensuring we're legal, etc. But perhaps not very much more on that. Over on the right-hand side is an organisation which is really probably spent some years on this. LGBTI inclusion is very much integrated into day-to-day work, day-to-day activities. The support from the top, there's a desire and a wish to create an environment that supports LGBTI inclusion and encourage the behaviours behind it. A company at level 4 has also dealt with some of the sensitive local issues as well, and recognises that you do need to localise the approach if we're going to make this work. Now, my view of this is there is no company that is actually level 1, level 2, level 3, or level 4. Probably many of us are parts of a number of levels. And I take my experience with Shell when I led the D&I team. There were certainly elements that we were doing there, and Shell had been at this for a long time, which I think could fairly classify as level 3 or level 4. More that we could do, of course. We could learn from others, but we were doing quite well in there. But again, I mentioned we went back and looked at some of the basics, so we had to come back to level 2 and look at some of the basics we had in place, learn from others, make some changes, put those things in place, and also those companies that do have a level of maturity can help those at the starting point. A long description, but spend a bit of time to discuss it within your teams. Where are you today? The next thing is, what do you aspire to? So where do you actually want to take this over the next 2-3 years? And that, I think, is important when you come to the action planning piece. And then really it's a case of selecting a few actions, doing a few things well. I think is what is important, and having a rapid impact, and also having a few actions in place which are going to make the difference over time. And lastly, and we all know this, and I know this, but how well do we do it? Communicate. Get the message out there, certainly internally, and wherever possible, get the message out there externally, and link it to the broader goals and the broader values of the organisation. So I've taken a couple of minutes over that. I think it's important to reflect and have that conversation before you embark into some of the details of implementation and actually mobilising the toolkit. I'd like next to talk a little bit about the action planning piece and give you an example of that. Now, we've mentioned earlier on, I gave you the overview of the 5 UN LGBTI standards. Again, you see the icons across the top. I won't read them out again, but they're hopefully familiar from the previous slide. And what we've done as we've pulled together this work, and I should say we've had help from all sorts of sources, including the UN, including a number of NGOs, and most importantly, a wide range of Workplace Pride members have provided help with this. And what we've done, we've come up with 12 themes. So there's 2 or 3 themes for each of the standards. And again, you can read across from, number 1, the LGBTI business case, and over on the right-hand side, you've got advocacy and diplomacy and civil society. And for each of those themes, we've developed an action template. And the point, and I'll show you an example in a moment, the action template is there to give some guidance on, number 1, what actions are required. Number 2, who needs to act? So again, that's about accountability. And thirdly, the tools for activation, which essentially is links to other documents, other guidance, quite a lot of which have been provided by Workplace Pride members. So it's not just a link to a website, it's actually a link to a well thought through piece of work, which come from a number of our member organisations who have been generous in providing those externally, so that other organisations can hopefully use that and learn from that as well. So again, 5 standards, 12 themes, and let me just run through and give you an example of number 1, which is the LGBTI business case. We did touch on that earlier, but we have a common theme for each of those themes. And again, on the left-hand side, you'll see some suggested actions, again, based on good practice, based on interviews that we did with Workplace Pride member companies, and based on a lot of external research which we've pulled together into this. So there are some suggestions on how to do it. Not quite step by step. It needs some discussion. It needs some thinking through. But again, I think in this case, if you can focus on those 6 points, then that will help with the LGBT business case. And what, from my experience, is so important here is taking that generic business case, which tends to be around talent and productivity and brand, and most importantly, a company's values, and then localizing that or making that real for your organization. Absolutely critical to get that within your own culture, within your own values. It may simply be adjusting the wording. It may be actually adjusting some of the content, and certainly looking at metrics which are relevant to your organization. And again, those action points are designed to help with that. The second column is who needs to act. And again, this changes for each of the themes that we have. And then thirdly, and I think critically, what we've done is to provide some curated links for further work, for further discussion and further reading, which should help as you develop this. So in this case, we've got the Workplace Pride business case for LGBTI inclusion, again going into a bit more detail. A fantastic piece of work from a not-for-profit called Open for Business, who themselves come up with the economic and business case, goes into a great deal of detail. You could almost argue too much detail, but a really good piece of work which can be used to supplement what you see on the left-hand side. And the third one we have here is from EY, who have, and again, another publicly available document, which give some ideas on how to advance LGBTI policy. Again, these are not just there because we found them on Google, they're there as part of the research, and hopefully are useful as far as developing this further is concerned. So again, just going back a moment, if I may, for those 12 themes, what we've done is to provide an action template like that, which goes into a bit more detail on each of the areas. But sticking with the theme of how to use the standards, we've talked about getting started. We've just gone into some detail around the action planning. And the next piece I'd like to come to is a third one, which is around good practices. And here you'll see, again, a number of great companies and great brands. And what we have here are links, and these link to another Workplace Pride document, which provide good practices under various areas such as employee networks, support and benefits, workplace awareness, expertise and monitoring, which are taken from the Workplace Pride annual benchmark. That's a survey which has been taking place for 6 years now. It started in 2014, and not only provides a benchmark around how Workplace Pride member companies are doing on LGBTI inclusion, but also provide some great examples of good practices which companies have been generous enough to share. And again, you can click through this and find more detail and find what these organisations are doing in this area. So again, I won't go name them name by name, but many thanks to all those organisations for the support that they've offered in this respect. And of course, there is more. I'm sure you'll have your own sources. Again, think about talking to your suppliers, think about talking to your customers. Use them as sources of information as well. It's not all about doing it yourself. It's also learning from others as well, which I think is important. So we've talked about getting started. We've talked about the action planning. These are the good practices. And the last thing is putting this all together into an implementation plan. Now, bear with me on this. It looks a bit busy. But what we've tried to do here, again, with those five standards at the top with the icons, is to put together a plan, an implementation plan for a company which probably now is reasonably mature in terms of what they're doing on LGBTI inclusion. But on the left-hand side, they're saying they need to go back and look at their business case and check out their code of conduct. Is it globally adopted? Have they added gender expression? It sounds like a detail, but still important in terms of getting the basics right. And then moving over to the right-hand side, they really want to move into their supply chain. They're going to brief their suppliers on LGBTI inclusion and also make the change to their standard terms and conditions. And there are many ways of doing this, but it's usually around suppliers commit to following their customers' values around diversity and inclusion. There's all sorts of different ways of doing this. And over on the right-hand side, this company is now dipping its toe into the external areas, perhaps outside their direct business domain, around advocacy and diplomacy and the civil society interface. A great example there. What is their strategy for engaging with civil society? How are they going to work with them in country? How are they going to partner with those organisations? So, this is the plan you see before you is not for any particular company. We've developed this in order to give an example of what a plan might look like. And again, I think I said this earlier, but it's also on the left-hand side of the slide. Think about it in terms of a multi-year plan. Think about the things that you can do in the near term. And think about the things which will be required longer term to try and sustain this. Every company will have a different plan, but the important thing is to have the dialogue and create the plan and make the commitments that go with it as well. And I would say I was discussing with some of the Workplace Pride members yesterday. Even if you consider yourself as pretty mature and been working on this for years, you can still use a lot of this content in order to review your LGBTI strategy, to refresh the business case, to get the commitment or recommitment of leaders. There's all sorts of different ways you can use this. So it's not just about let's use the standards, but it's how can we use the standards in order to improve LGBTI inclusion in our workplace and indeed beyond. So coming now to the end of this, we've spent a bit of time on how. So as ever, it's not just about what we're doing now; it's what we're doing in the future, and how are we dealing with perhaps some of the more difficult issues which arise around LGBTI inclusion. And I'll give you an example of that in just a moment. How do we, stop? Often these things, I've seen this with employee networks, they get off to a great launch and there's lots of excitement and commitment, and you come back a year or two later and they're still there, but they're perhaps not really having the impact that you'd like them to have. So how do we sustain this? How do we keep refreshing it? How do we keep the momentum? And once again, we've curated a number of themes here, which these don't apply to a particular one of the UN standards. They go really across the whole piece. And we've pulled together some guidance, again, based on Workplace Pride benchmark information, plus the generous support of our member companies, and pulled together guidance under a number of areas there. The one on sensitive countries is particularly important, and I know from my Shell days, a one-size-fits-all approach to LGBTI inclusion for a UK Dutch-based company would not work in certain parts of the world where we operated, particularly the Middle East and Southeast Asia. That doesn't mean to say that the issues around values and respect for employees, respect for customers, etc., they may be the same, but actually how it's put into practice is different. And you may need to start the conversation with different places. Certainly, I found in the Middle East, starting a conversation around sexual orientation did not achieve very much. Starting a conversation around respect achieved a great deal. So it's more than just wording; it's thinking through that. So again, we've come up with some guidance which hopefully will help with that. The second one, again, we're aware, of course, there are lots of other initiatives out there. There are things like World Economic Forum work on LGBTI. There's Workplace Pride's own Declaration of Amsterdam, which has been out for about 10 years now. And we don't want to kind of confuse and just add another piece of work in. These things do all connect together, and we've done something around alignment with other initiatives as well. And fourthly, and lastly, let me just point out the acting in the public sphere. I think I've already mentioned Open for Business. They've done some terrific work diving down into that fifth standard, the acting in the public sphere standard, put together a great guidance document, which again, there are links, and you can download that if that's the area that you want to really dive into detail on. So again, these are all ways that we can seek to sustain this. And then finally, just really just wrapping this up. We've mentioned we've had some tremendous help with this work. It's well researched. There's been quite a lot of peer review going on. We've obviously taken a lot from our member companies, but we've also had help from a number of other organisations, both from the content side and the design side. You can see Open for Business there, Out Leadership, and also the Human Rights Office of the United Nations have been very supportive of this as well. I would just like to finish by hopefully this session has whetted your appetites, has created some curiosity, and maybe the one action you'll take is to follow up and discuss within your teams. Let me just say, if you want to find out more about Access, well, the one route is through the email there. But we've actually gone further than this as of today. If for those who are not members of Workplace Pride, you can find the presentation that you've just seen here on the Workplace Pride website. That's www.workplacepride.org. And it's under Solutions, and you can see this interactive web-based version of the toolkit, and you can also download that in PowerPoint and Keynote versions to take away. And for Workplace Pride members, we also have a version which goes into quite a bit more detail on those various action templates and some of the other guidance. And again, if you're interested in Workplace Pride membership, getting full access, then please feel free to contact us on info at Workplace Pride. So I think, David, back to you, more or less on time. I got through it. There's a lot covered there. We're seeing a lot of questions coming through. Let me hand back to you for to take us through the next piece, please.
Well, thank you very much, Graham. I think one of the things that always strikes me when I see this presentation is that even though it's about the United Nations, of course, their toolkit, it's so helpful for any organization, from a corporate to civil society organizations to academia, anybody who is starting on their LGBTI workplace inclusion journey, to have a look at this, because it's very well thought out, and as we saw in your last slide, it's very inclusive as well, because we've worked with other organizations closely, with our members, as well as with Open for Business, etc., to make sure that we could have as comprehensive of a toolkit as possible. So now let me give the floor to Mike Greenwood. Mike is our moderator. You've been seeing him writing in, and I believe that Mike has some questions from some of our participants.
Thank you very much, David, for that, and thank you everybody in the chat and watching, and thank you for the questions. First of all, Marion has a question, and she asks, are the 700 plus companies that are endorsing the standards listed somewhere?
Marion, yeah, thank you. It's there are actually 270 companies. We think it's about 290 now who have endorsed this, and I can gladly send you the link. But actually, in that presentation on slide 5, there's where it says more than 270 companies have endorsed the UN LGBTI standards. That's got a soft link to the website which the UN maintain, which has got the full list. But if you can't find it, just drop me a message and I'll help you with that.
Great. Okay, next question is from Anik, and what is your point of view regarding a definition of diversity and inclusion within an organization?
Yeah, that question's come up once or twice before, right? I've been working on this area for about more than 10 years now, and I've never come up with one definition which fits everything. And there are several. And it's one of those things that some people like one definition, sometimes like another. I suppose, and you can add lots of words around this. I remember sweating over a slide at Shell where we went through this in great detail. Beautiful slide, of course, but it was hard labour at the time. But I think for me, and again, David, interested in your perspective, I think it comes down to something about diversity being what makes us unique. And much as we may wish to talk about, gender and age and ethnicity, to me, it's about diversity of thought and everything that comes from that. So those are the things that you see two people on the screen. That's one of the things that makes me and David different. We think differently. Fine, that's good. And let's recognise that, celebrate that, and use that. And for me, inclusion is about what brings us together. So I've enjoyed tremendous collaboration with the Workplace Pride team and Workplace Pride members working on this. We're all different as individuals, but we collaborate together. So, it's one person's definition. There is some great work being done around that point, around the uniqueness on the diversity side and the belongingness or togetherness, belongingness. On the inclusion side, it's not a bad definition, but I'm aware it's not the only one. But that would be my pitch. David, how do you see it?
Well, I agree with you, Graham. I think I would just mainly add that I've been doing this now for 14 years. Before that, I was in the corporate world for almost 20 years. So I've seen both sides, from the civil society as well as the corporate side. And I have seen quite a bit of evolution over the years as well about what diversity and inclusion actually means. At the beginning, it was all very much about the business case, at least when it was all about LGBT. And now, as you've said a couple of times in your own presentation, it's much more about doing the right thing. And what we've seen with the pandemic and our changing of, as a global society, thinking about different things, the moral question comes up more and more often. And I like what you said at the very end, whereas at the beginning, when I started my career, it was all about diversity. And then 10 years later, inclusion came into it. And more, I'm hearing a lot about belonging now.
Yeah.
Recently, there was a presentation to the European Commission about this. And so it seems to be becoming something that we're all understanding as a global society as well. And certainly that applies to the LGBTI community, because belonging is one of the most important things that we want. We want respect and we want to belong.
Absolutely. Thanks, David.
Wonderful.
Back to you.
Okay. Shubha has a question and asks, how has or will COVID affect work around LGBTI inclusion in the workplace? Any thoughts on those challenges and ways to deal with those?
Yeah, I think we're all reading so much about this now. So it's probably a question which has got many strands to it, and there's no way I'm going to cover that in a couple of minutes. But I think one of the themes that's coming through strongly for me is and we're still in the place of speculation, but we seem to have finally broken down all the ridiculous barriers and restrictions and things which used to be in our workplace around flexible working, which, by the way, I've always seen a bit of an issue of trust, not an issue of policy. It's ultimately a trust issue, and we're seeing those changes, and we're seeing it working, and that's at many levels that's good, and we're all experiencing that today. However, it also raises a concern for me, and we're all different in our how we deal with this. But this distributed world we live in at the moment, and who knows where it goes in the future, could also lead to exclusion. It could lead to people feeling marginalised, dropping off, whatever. And I know we've all got our lists of how to run an effective Zoom call and all the rest of it, but I can only personalize this. I do not find it that easy. I don't find it the same as being with people. So, in a social context. And I think, again, I'm extrapolating this a little bit, but we then know that any marginalized group, whether it be for, LGBT community, etc., if marginalization is happening or exclusion is happening, it's probably going to be worse for them. We've already seen, and I mentioned it earlier, some of the hate crimes rising, attitudes of governments and all the rest of it. Nasty stuff going on out there. And I think, to me, this distributed virtual flexible workplace, much as it has many benefits to it, and we'll see that over time, also has some risk to it. And that, for me, is the biggest concern I'd have around the LGBTI community. And again, why I think what we've been talking about today, and again, not, as David said, it's not just about the standards. It's about, what do we do, our approach, etc., is even more important now than perhaps it has been over the last few years. One person's view. David, would you like to add anything in there?
Definitely. First of all, I have to say hello to Shuba in Chennai. Shuba, just for the participants here, actually took part in our conference in India, which we organized together. Yes, with the Solidarity Foundation. So she's in a very good place to ask about what the impact is from this crisis. And I personally think it's quite substantial as well. Yesterday, Workplace Pride, we had our quarterly Global Leaders Council meeting, and it came up there as well. And what kind of stuck in my mind from that discussion was that the individual is going to be much more in the spotlight, not just for the LGBTI community, but the individual in general.
Yeah.
A lot of us are trapped at home, as it were. And it's, the downside of that is people can tend to be much more isolated. And for LGBTI people, it can be very difficult to be in a situation where you truly cannot be yourselves. That's one side, and on the other side, there's quite a bit of potential here as well. Even through this type of webinar, we're probably reaching a lot more people than we would have in a normal circumstance. Having people from different places in the world, like India, calling in is a good thing. It's much easier for us to connect. But I was wondering also, today I heard, maybe some of you heard as well, that Twitter is now saying that their employees can actually work from home forever.
Yes,
so,
saw that, yeah.
You saw that, yeah. So it's we're at the beginning of a change. And I think for the LGBTI community, we have to, first of all, take stock of what's happening around us. What Workplace Pride is trying to do through this seminar series, our programming this year, is to make sure that we stay in connection with the community and with our members, with civil society, to make sure that the topic of LGBTI inclusion, specifically in the workplace for us, does not fall off the agendas. We have seen persecution already in countries. I believe that there are some African countries where LGBTI people are actually being blamed for the virus. And ultimately, this will have an impact on the workplace as well. So workplaces, the civil society, we need to have an open and transparent way of talking about this topic, how the pandemic is going to affect us. And my advice to everybody would be to stick together as much as we can, keep an open and transparent dialogue, and don't forget that at the end of the pandemic, when organizations want to beef up their diversity and inclusion efforts again, it's going to be much easier to have kept that consistency going throughout the pandemic as opposed to stopping and then restarting.
Yeah.
And this is partly the message that I hope will come also from civil society organizations to businesses and vice versa. That diversity and inclusion does not stop just because there's a pandemic or a crisis. It's something that's around us all the time, and it always will be. So we need to make sure we support it as much as possible.
Yeah. It's a great point, David. And again, back to the toolkit. It's one way to refresh and re-energize what we should be doing anyway. I agree with you.
Yes.
Okay, back to questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Pedro feels that the toolkit is a great piece of work, and he was just wondering, has the UN endorsed this toolkit? He can see the logo on the slides and assumes that that's the case.
Thanks, Pedro, and hi, nice to have you on the call as well. Absolutely. So we've worked closely with the UN on this. Technically, they're not endorsing it, and this is not about the toolkit; it's about how they operate. But what they have done is to provide us with a really well-written forward, which will go at the front of the toolkit. I've actually got it in front of me. I'm looking at it now. We didn't quite get it in time for the launch. But we hope within a couple of weeks we'll do a short update to the toolkit, and we'll add the message from the United Nations in there. And again, that's coming from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So great to have their support on that as well. And I'm sure some of you will have noticed that the design of this toolkit is beautiful, but it does pick up and we've picked up the United Nations blue as we go through this. So it is a workplace pride toolkit, but it has a strong should we say, tone and sense of the UN behind it as well, which I think is great for workplace pride and great for those using it.
Wonderful. Okay, Marion has a question, and specifically to Graham. Can you share examples of advocacy and diplomacy successes or good practices?
Yeah, I think you could start close to home with that, and if we look at what Workplace Pride has done over the years with its international conferences around the world. I was directly involved with the one in the Philippines and also in Poland, and David has mentioned Chennai. They've taken place in Russia and in Kenya, and I haven't got the full list in my head, but they've been taking place over the years. And David, I'm sure can say far more than I can on this, but what's been so important to me sponsoring those from a business angle was the fact that they were, you were working with Workplace Pride, but also you were working with civil society on the ground in a number of cases through the diplomatic missions in those countries as well, particularly the Dutch, but also others. I've met the New Zealand ambassador to the Philippines and various other ambassadors around the world. Really nicely done this, and the point I'm getting at is that's an example of how companies who, for various reasons, may be a little cautious about stepping into this can do that in a if you like, in a safe way, and make that bridge into civil society and into more advocacy and diplomacy. The very fact, and I don't take this lightly, the very fact that companies have come out there with their public support for these standards is another way of doing that advocacy and diplomacy. And then, of course, you've got to drive it right down to the front line. In the workplace, in the local communities, as to what they're doing. So, I'm sure there are many more examples, but there are a couple that come.
He's
back now. Sorry, David. Did you want to add anything on that point around civil advocacy and diplomacy?
No, I think you hit it well. I mean, getting a good balance between the needs of civil society organizations and businesses has always been a challenge, and not just for Workplace Pride, for many organizations who are doing similar work to what we're doing around the world. But going back to what I said previously, I think it's so important that we all work together. And you touched upon it, Graham, that in all of the international events that Workplace Pride has done abroad, we always work with local civil society organizations because we know very well that we don't have all the answers. For example, last August, we did our conference in Singapore at the IBM's head offices there, and we worked very closely with Pink Dot and an organization called Ugachaga, which has been very deeply involved in the local LGBTI Singaporean community there, as well as with the Dutch ambassador to Singapore.
Yes.
So it's important to keep all of these various parties involved. Again, civil society, the diplomatic community, the business community, and where you can also the public sector. I remember, Graham, you'll remember as well, that in Manila, we had actually the first transgender congressperson in the Philippines. And that was so empowering, not just for our own community there, but for businesses to see that, yes, our community is everywhere and we're respected and we do good work. So this lovely mix, the way I see it at least, this lovely mix of civil society and businesses, the diplomatic community, and public sector governments is really what's going to move our movement forward, keep our movement going forward.
Yep.
Right, wonderful, thank you. Marion's got lots of questions. This
yes,
was a double-barreled question.
that.
This is to Graham. How can NGOs and activists tap into this great work? How can they reach the 270 or 25 Workplace Pride members? And are we talking funding or different types of cooperation?
Yeah, I don't feel qualified to answer on the funding question, so maybe I'll divert that to David in a moment. But let's first of all talk about getting involved. I mean, yeah, again, it's I hope the words came across all right, but this is not just about the corporate world. It's also around the partnerships and how those partnerships between civil society and the business world work. So being involved in discussion, just downloading this toolkit or looking at this toolkit online, and then using that in the discussion with their clients, the networks, raising the profile of the standards. you're not asking every civil society organisation to endorse the standards, but using them, talking about them, making them relevant, and really providing that help with how to go about this will be tremendously useful. I've mentioned Open for Business a couple of times. We're not in competition here. They've done great work. They've really gone into depth on this issue of acting in the public sphere. And again, the biggest thing that probably civil society can do is to try and bring this work to life, to make it practical, to help organisations who may be nervous, tentative about doing this, worried about all sorts of branding issues, and in my view, none of which are really material. But yeah, okay, I know those concerns happen. Working out how to do that, and also looking at it on a local basis, linking it to human rights, and focusing it, in the workplace around eliminating discrimination, both at work and in society. So there's a lot of words there, but I hope that the content of this toolkit and the discussion that takes place as a result will help with that.
Great. We're running kind of low on time, but I'll fire the questions if that's okay.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Pedro was was wondering if there's any guidance for corporates when engaging with civil society, and perhaps how to avoid the risk of being accused of pinkwashing.
So the answer is yes. And again, on the more general point, Pedro, of engagement with civil society, I'm going to push it back, and in view of the time, take a look at the toolkit, take a look at the examples which are in there, and the various links that we've got. And start to have that dialogue with the civil society organisations you work with locally. I do want to highlight one specific thing on pinkwashing. I'm just taking my glasses off to be able to read properly. There's a great report called Demystifying D&I, which I came across a couple of months ago at a presentation in London. It's put together by an organisation who have experience around branding, but also experience around pinkwashing and greenwashing, and probably many other sorts of washing. It's referenced in the toolkit under business communication, and probably is one of the better, or a very good practical guide in terms of how to deal with this, and how to deal with some of the cynicism and suspicion that can sometimes come up, often unfairly, but sometimes it is real. So pinkwashing is important, and again, it's a good prompt, Pedro, because it's another example of a piece of content which we've curated and provided the links to, which hopefully will be useful in dealing with that.
Okay, wonderful. I think we have time for one more question, and it's from Marion, who says, would be great to discuss also about not just improving LGBT inclusion internally, and in parentheses says, we do not need the UN for that, but how we can use the UN and the standards to improve LGBT plus inclusion in the marketplace, especially in countries where it is increasingly difficult, also nearby in Poland and Hungary, for example. What can we do together there right now?
Yeah, and Marianne, thanks for the question, and did just also want to acknowledge I talked during the presentation around the so-called maturity model, and I'd like to credit you and IBM with some of the initial ideas around that. We've adapted them, but this idea of maturity is important. The reason I mention it is because, again, a number of companies on this call and out there have been working on this for years, and you can consider fairly mature in terms of what they're doing internally, to get to your point, but it's the external piece that's important, and I think the elements of that external dialogue, they've got elements of being local. So Poland and Hungary you mentioned. I think you cannot do a kind of read across from a more generic case. There's a piece of again working with civil society organisations in this country, in those countries, and thirdly, and again we don't have time to go through it here, is diving down into those action templates around advocacy and diplomacy. And the second one around working with civil society in terms of the specific actions that could be taken, and then again working with in this case with Workplace Pride to figure out what that means in practice. It's easy to make this answer sound generic. We can get very specific, but it has to be on a real life example involving specific organisations, specific civil society organisations, and also countries or regions. And I think that's how we can take it forward. David, would you like to add anything onto the back of that one?
No, I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head, Graham. I mean, it's also a question of tenacity and continuing to go after this. I know that sometimes it can get quite frustrating because progress is not being made as quickly as certainly we would like for it to be made. But by working together, we will certainly be able to do it. And again, let me mention here that if there are initiatives from our member organizations or from civil society organizations that they would like us to take up, the door is open. And by working together, we can at least begin to, tackle these topics. Great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we're getting close to the end. So I'd like to thank everybody very much for the questions that you've sent in. I want to thank, first I wanted to mention very quickly again that you can find these presentations already on our website. If you go to workplacepride.org, in the top navigation bar, you'll see solutions. And under solutions, you'll see the United Nations Toolkit. And there you will find this presentation that Graham just gave, both in PowerPoint and Keynote. And we encourage you to spread the news as much as possible. And if you have questions, you can always send them to info@workplacepride.org. And finally, I did want to mention, or actually thank, everybody who has helped us to put these webinars together so far. It's not an easy task. So I'd like to thank Mike Greenwood, our moderator. I'd like to thank the Workplace Pride staff behind the scene, because there are a number of people working to make this happen for our members and for our other stakeholders. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Graham very much for your efforts, not just for this webinar, Graham, but for the past year. Working on this toolkit, it's for, I think, not just for Workplace Pride, but for our community. It's a milestone piece of work. It's something that we can all look back on as a reference. And I'm hoping that people will be able to use it as much as possible.
Good. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you, David.
Final word is that our next webinar will be next Wednesday, same time, same place, at 1 o'clock Central European Time. And our speaker will be Margot Slattery. Margot is the Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer of Sodexo. She was previously the CEO of Sodexo in Ireland. She's openly LGBT and has a fascinating perspective. And she's going to be talking about the position of women in the workplace, and specifically in times of crisis. So I hope you'll all tune into that. The invitations will go out tomorrow, and the information will also be on our website. So thank you all very much again, and we hope to see you next week. Thank you.
Thanks.